It's a pleasure to be back here at Cal State and meet some new friends and touch bases with some old ones. My activist career began here, and it's great to be able to come back and touch my roots. I'm titling my talk, The Top 10 Reasons the Environmental Movement Has Been Failing and What We Can Do About it. My intent is to give a global lay of the land, borrowing a phrase from our Sierra Club campaign planning manual, and reflect on the state of the environment from a broad, big picture perspective, and the health of the environmental movement in particular. Looking back over the last 36 years, since the first Earth Day, how are we doing? I've got some good news and I've got some bad news. First, the good news. Clearly, we've made a lot of progress in some areas. The air in a number of large urban areas like here in the Inland Empire is cleaner than it was in the 60s and 70s due to auto and power plant pollution control devices mandated by the Clean Air Act. And this improvement has occurred even as the number of cars in California has increased more than tenfold. In my home city of Boise, Idaho, though, the air quality is deteriorating, caused primarily by the enormous population growth Idaho has experienced in the last 15 years, largely as the result of fellow refugees from California like me. On the water quality front, more waters are fishable and swimmable than was the case 40 years ago due to the mandates of the Clean Water Act. Rivers no longer catch fire due to flammable pollutants, as was a fairly regular occurrence 35 years ago. And thanks to the protections afforded by the Endangered Species Act of 1973, some species that were endangered 40 years ago are in better shape, some so dramatically that they've been removed from the endangered species list, such as the bald eagle. In sum, the good news is that we know how to go about cleaning up our environment and have had some success at doing so. Now the bad news. In March of 2005, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment was published, which drew on 22 national science academies from around the world. Walt Reed, the leader of the report's core authors, warned, quoting, "The bottom line of this assessment is that we are spending the Earth's natural capital, putting such strain on the natural functions of the Earth that the ability of the planet's ecosystems to sustain future generations can no longer be taken for granted. The changes in policy and practice required are substantial and not currently underway." End of quote. So why are we in this predicament? We know what we're doing. We are changing the climate. We are, knowingly, causing the wholesale extirpation of whole classes of life forms in one of the greatest extinction spasms to ever hit our planet. Why then are we still headed to the brink of the cliff? In September 2004, Michael Schellenberger and Ted Nordhaus authored a controversial essay entitled The Death of Environmentalism, and then distributed it to a number of foundations who regularly fund environmental groups. The debate generated by this essay has been covered by the New York Times and other national newspapers and has been the subject of many debates on NPR and elsewhere. Schellenberg and Nordhaus offer what is essentially a postmodernist explanation for why we environmentalists have been having a hard time in recent times advancing our agenda. Boiling their 40-page essay down to its essence, they assert that we've been thinking about the environment in the wrong way, and if we thought about it the right way, namely their way, we'd start making progress. This would be good news if it were true. Environmental salvation is just around the corner once we adopt their way of analyzing the problem. Unfortunately, I think they're wrong. Here then is my list, my top 10 reasons that our work has been stymied. Reason number 1, lack of genuine governmental commitment. First, while we passed some fairly good environmental laws in the 60s and 70s, some of which I've already mentioned, and others like the National Environmental Policy Act and the Wilderness Act, no administration, Republican or Democratic, has been truly aggressive in promoting environmental protection. Instead, administrations have ranged from tepid support to active hostility. Contrary to some opinions, Bill Clinton was no environmentalist. Reason number 2, we've only tackled a third of the problem. For the most part, environmental groups, including the Sierra Club, have only tackled 1/3 of the problem. More than 3 decades ago, Stanford biologist Paul Ehrlich, famous for his book, The Population Bomb, taught us that the environmental impact of humans is a function of 3 things: our population, our level of affluence, and our technologies. Environmentalists, as a movement, have tended to focus primarily on wildlands protection through the creation of new wilderness areas, parks, or preserves, and on technological fixes, such as improved pollution controls and fuel efficiency, and on alternatives to fossil fuels, pesticides, and wood fiber. We focused here because it's easier to organize a movement by identifying a villain or group of villains, such as polluting corporations and their bought and paid for politicians, and plan activities against those targets. Indeed, our Sierra Club campaign planning manual specifically advises us to do this. Everybody likes being a good guy and going after a bad guy. And, as I've already noted, the approach has produced some real successes. Population and consumption issues, though, strike closer to home and challenge our very own lifestyle choices, including the choices of many dues-paying members of environmental organizations. As a result, we haven't taken a strong stand regarding our increasing domestic and global population or our high and increasing rates of per capita consumption. We at the Sierra Club have a National Sustainable Consumption Committee, but we give it very little in the way of resources, and it really isn't an emphasis within the Sierra Club. Again, it's far more fun to target bad guys out there than to take an introspective look at our own choices and lifestyles, both in regard to our level of resource consumption and our reproductive choices. Nevertheless, at the risk of discomfort, let's look at consumption. A now familiar statistic bears repeating. The US accounts for 5% of the world's population, but consumes anywhere from 25 to 40% of its resources, depending on the natural resource you're looking at, and emits 25% of its greenhouse gases. This is a staggering statistic, and I think most people unconsciously avoid really looking at it. The statistic screams out an incredibly ugly fact, namely that the lifestyle we so enjoy living is not sustainable with resources from our own country, and we are sustaining our lifestyle only by mining and stripping the rest of the planet, thereby driving other life forms into extinction, impoverishing cultures elsewhere, and denying future generations of humans, both here and abroad, a livable planet. And if that isn't bad enough, surveys by social psychologists reveal that whether a given household has an annual income of $50,000 or $500,000, they believe they could attain true happiness if only they had twice their current income and could thereby double their consumption. And on the population front, the US continues to grow at the fastest rate of any of the developed countries. In sum, even though we live on a finite planet, our actual numbers and our individual per capita rate of consumption are both increasing, both here at home and abroad. Reason number 3, partial success means less public interest. For a long time, the leaders within the environmental movement have considered the problem essentially one of education, or what cognitive scientist Lakoff calls the facts will set you free approach. Once enough people are informed about the damage we are causing, these newly informed people will spontaneously alter their behavior, and in our democratic society will demand laws that correct earth-harming behaviors of for-profit enterprises. People are basically good, after all, and will naturally take the steps necessary to protect our life-sustaining planet. This was a viable hypothesis in the 1970s, when the various threats were first becoming widely appreciated and understood. Educate people, and they'll do the right thing. However, it hasn't really worked out that way. The level of public interest in environmental issues has actually declined. Part of the reason for this is something I don't think we anticipated at the first Earth Day in 1970. The very improvements that came with more effective regulation of air and water pollution, the partial cleanup of toxic dumps, the wilderness designation or other protection of particularly popular areas, and the recovery of previously endangered popular species like the bald eagle and wolves means that for an increasing portion of the American public, environmental issues just don't seem as urgent. The Sierra Club is quite successful in getting people directly affected by environmental harms engaged, whether it's a proposed incinerator nearby or nuclear waste at Yucca Mountain. But for most people, if it's not happening in your neighborhood, you don't really worry about it. It's not on your radar screen. This translates into less pressure on public officials. Reason number 4, out of sight, out of mind. Another reason that keeps environmental problems off the radar screen is the global consumption patterns I mentioned a moment ago. For example, we import 60% of our oil. Setting aside the global warming effects for a moment, that means that 60% of the real environmental effects of our oil use is felt not by us here in the US, but by people elsewhere in the world. The same goes for all those resources that we're importing from elsewhere. We import 40% of our wood fiber, mostly from Canada, meaning we don't actually see all the square miles of clear-cut lands our wood product use actually creates. Reason number 5, Orwell was off by 20 years. If you've never read Orwell's 1984, you should. It turns out he was only off by about 20 years. The George W. Bush administration has elevated Orwellian doublespeak to an art form. He proposes a Clear Skies initiative that would effectively repeal the Clean Air Act by allowing utilities to pollute at current levels for an additional 20 years beyond what is allowed under current law. He proposed and tricked Congress into passing a Healthy Forest Initiative that really just increases incentives to log national forests while doing little or nothing to increase protection for small communities at risk for wildfire. You know what this administration's been up to. I won't further belabor the details of his multiple assaults here. If you would like more details on that, I would commend to your reading our executive director's book, Strategic Ignorance, Why the Bush Administration is Turning Back the Clock on 100 Years of Environmental Progress. There is a quip often attributed to Abraham Lincoln that you can fool some of the people all of the time, and all of the people some of the time, but you cannot fool all of the people all of the time. Well, as a political principle, this administration seems to have discovered that you only need to fool enough of the people enough of the time. And this is a real problem for the environmental movement. Many people naturally want to believe what their government tells them and find it hard to believe that their government officials will blatantly lie. Now, I actually see some hidden good news in Bush's strategy. Clearly, the Bush team believes that the American people would never accept these aggressive assaults on our environmental health if they were honestly presented. They obviously believe that they can only succeed by hiding behind this Orwellian doublespeak. It remains to be seen if their strategy will work over the long term. Reason number 6, beware of weapons of mass distraction. Recall a time a century and a half ago when people traveled considerable distances by horse and buggy to stand in uncomfortable clothing in the hot sun for 3 hours to listen to Lincoln and Douglas debate. Can you imagine that kind of attention to important issues today? How much easier it is to watch TV, catch a movie, play a video game. We who seek greater public attention to and involvement in important public issues are up against some beguiling alternative activities. Those who move forward a damaging agenda rely on that distraction. Reason number 7, postmodern relativism. About 15 years ago, I started noticing a new argument being advanced against involvement in environmental or other social justice causes. It goes something like this. You want to save the earth, I want to make money off the earth's resources. Both are just opinions, equally without basis. We don't really know anything. Thus, you keep your opinion and I'll keep mine. Most environmentalists don't buy into this kind of thinking, but I've been surprised by the growing number who do. And it causes them to mute or soften their advocacy efforts. To those who have begun buying into this thinking, it's unseemly to say that anything is right or wrong. Further, I'm told by college students in the Sierra Student Coalition that this kind of relativistic thinking is rampant and deeply ingrained in many campuses. I'll be interested to hear from you if you think it's ingrained here. And this greatly inhibits their ability to recruit a new generation of environmental activists. The genesis of this new problem is long and complex, but it's a real problem, and a real problem for environmental activism. Reason number 8, my memes are making me do it. At the end of his 1976 book, The Selfish Gene, biologist Richard Dawkins coined a new term, meme, a word that he intentionally fashioned to rhyme with gene. Dawkins defines a meme as a unit of intellectual or cultural information that survives long enough to be recognized as such and which can pass from mind to mind. Relevant to our discussion this evening, here's an example of an anti-environmental meme. I was showing my Aunt Betty, a pious fundamentalist Christian, some pictures of a recent trip to Yosemite, and she exclaimed to me, "You know, heaven will be much nicer." Well, of course, she does not actually know that that's the case because she has no personal experience of that fact. But the meme, "Heaven will be much nicer," has taken up residence in her. As a result, she thinks my efforts to save the planet are an utter waste of time. God's going to make a new world soon. Why worry too much about this one? Here's another bad meme. I should be able to do anything I want with my land and maximize its profit to me, regardless of the effect on the larger community. You get the idea. I'm sure you can think of other examples. Once these bad ideas lodge themselves in the gray matter of an individual human brain, they're very hard to get out. And these bad memes create real barriers to environmental groups. Reason number 9 is what I call nature's flaw. Paul Ehrlich and Robert Ornstein hypothesize that humans are affected by a lack of natural selection for response to slowly developing threats. They explain this reason as follows. Hundreds of thousands or millions of years ago, our ancestors' survival depended in large part on the ability to respond quickly to threats that were immediate, personal, palpable. Threats like the sudden crack of a branch as it's about to give way, or the roar of a flash flood racing down a narrow valley. Threats like the darkening of the entrance of a cavern as a giant bear enters. Threats like a thrown spear. Those are not threats generated by complex technological devices accumulated over decades by unknown people half a world away. Those are not threats like the slow atmospheric buildup of carbon dioxide from auto exhausts, power plants, and deforestation. Not threats like the gradual depletion of the ozone layer. Thus, the human mind evolved to register short-term changes from moment to moment, day to day, and season to season, and to overlook the backdrop against which those changes take place. Ornstein and Ehrlich argue further that not only couldn't our ancestors detect slow changes in their environment, there wasn't much they could do about them in any event. They either migrated or perished. Perhaps natural selection tended to favor those who didn't even bother worrying about things they couldn't change. However, since the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago, and especially the industrial and public health revolutions during just the last 2 centuries, we have dramatically altered the evolutionary game plan. Now we are capable of and are inflicting enormous damage to the planet. But our Stone Age sensibilities render most of us oblivious and indifferent to this developing catastrophe. Reason number 10. Is it possible we just don't care? Finally, and perhaps most troubling, is it possible we know what we're doing to the planet, know what we need to do to stop, but just don't want to? If that's true, it's a big problem because people rarely do what they don't want to do. The potential truth of this hypothesis of mine was driven home for me a few years ago when I was giving a presentation on the environmental effects of logging in our national forest to a high school environmental science class in Mountain Home, Idaho. I had made my standard pitch about how we could end the commercial logging of our national forests if we would just recycle more than we currently do and begin using alternative wood building products. In the question and answer period, a young man declared that we won't recycle more and we won't use alternative building supplies, and that we just have to get used to the fact that it is human nature to destroy the natural world. In his words, he said, "We are the destroyer species, and there's no point getting upset about it." I protested and said I was counting on his generation to start doing things the right way. I was stunned by the casualness of his statement and his willing acceptance of a destructive role. Is that young man right? Are we the destroyer species? Some scholars think he is. Garrett Hardin and B.F. Skinner have noted that the evolutionary law of natural selection has ensured that we will pursue our immediate self-interest and that of our immediate offspring. And zoologist Frans de Waal has noted that concern for the welfare of a member of another species is completely unknown in non-humans. And given the indifference of most people to our ongoing extinction crisis, it's a rather rare trait in humans as well. Further, the pioneering work in the area of sociobiology by E.O. Wilson and others has shown that even some types of seemingly unselfish behavior can be selfish in a biological sense. Much of what humans call moral behavior can be seen as selfishly motivated. I agree not to kill you, you agree not to kill me. I won't steal from you, you won't steal from me. Biologists call this reciprocal altruism. The restraint I show is primarily for my own self-interest. I agree to restrain myself in return for you showing restraint. So with acknowledgement to David Letterman, that's my top 10 list. I'm sure we could think of others. Publicly stating these reasons is somewhat controversial. I've been challenged for stating them out loud in public. While few have questioned my analysis, I'm told I just shouldn't state them because they're too depressing. Instead, I'm told we as environmentalists should just talk about that part of the problem that we think the public already agrees with. I call this Pollyanna environmentalism. Just talk about the positive instead of doing the hard work of actually shifting public opinion to a stronger, broader environmental ethic. I advocate for the tougher path, hard though it is. We can't make these factors I've described disappear by just agreeing amongst ourselves not to talk about them. Now that I've depressed you enough, are there any hopeful facts? Another item from the world of biology provides this glimmer of hope. Again, zoologist Frans de Waal, in his book Good Natured, describes an experiment where a group of rhesus monkeys were placed in a common living space with stump-tailed macaques. Stump-tails are easygoing and tolerant, whereas rhesus monkeys have a rigid hierarchy strictly enforced through violent behavior. Over the course of 5 months, the rhesus monkeys took on a more gentle, tolerant behavior of the stump-tails, and then retained those behaviors when once again put by themselves. In other words, the social culture of one species was successfully infused into a group from another species. This success shows that the typical behavior of the rhesus is to some extent culturally learned as opposed to being genetically innate. The good news is that if our civilization were serious about creating a more earth-friendly human culture, we certainly could. But what will make us serious about creating such a culture before it's too late to save the diverse splendor of our planet that still remains? I frequently ask people, environmentalists and others, for their opinion on this, and the usual response is that nothing much will change until things get worse. People will change when circumstances force them. If this is true, it seems the planet's fate is to suffer ever-worsening despoilation. Jane Goodall, in her book Reason for Hope, suggests that we must all become at least mini-saints, each doing our fair share to save the planet. Of course, she's right. This is what must happen if any part of the remaining splendor of our planet is to be salvaged. But is there hope? Is there time still left to save the planet? We don't know, and it's impossible to know. And fortunately, this is a good thing. To paraphrase E.F. Schumacher, if we thought there was enough time, we'd become complacent and we'd do nothing. If we thought it was too late, we'd give up in despair and do nothing. In the end, the only way it is hopeless is if we all decide to sit back. I urge you to resist this. Instead, I want to close by suggesting that the answer to the question of hope lies deep in each of our hearts and the hearts of our friends, families, and coworkers. If we, all of us, environmentalists and otherwise, are willing to come to terms with what we're doing and to make a commitment to making the necessary changes that we all know are necessary, then yes, there is hope. May we all make the choice for a better environmental future. Thank you.
Just to start off the questioning, so thinking about, we're looking here at Southern California. Of course, you would recognize there's been lots of changes since you were here. We're pushing out into the desert. Banning in Beaumont used to be just, little gas stations off to the side. Now they're becoming 20,000, 30,000. And yet, we can, in a way, apologize for that because we're building in certain kinds of wind power out in the desert and so forth. I guess I'm wondering, is that a rationalization? How do you look upon what's taking place with the congestion taking place? There's discussions about adding, the freeway's going to be completed with 210. We can go all the way over to the 5 now, correct, 210 with Dino. That's going to save gasoline, going to help eliminate congestion, but in the long run, it's going to cause more traffic congestion. So, on the one hand, it's a dilemma. Are we rationalizing by just all the things that we're doing in terms of recycling, in terms of spending money on transportation, mass transit, or are we really environmentalists?
That's a good question. That's a matter of internal debate within the Sierra Club. Between, the Sierra Club often tends to be very siloed. You have anti-sprawl activists, and then you have energy activists. The energy activists just want to talk about raising fuel efficiency standards for cars. The anti-sprawl people say, well, that just facilitates sprawl. And the energy activist says, oh, you sprawl people are crazy. There's just no way we're ever going to stop sprawl. And so, we've got to focus on fuel efficiency standards. So, I'm the first to admit that the Sierra Club in particular, because we are such a democratic organization, with about 3,000 elected leaders across the U.S., is not always internally consistent in everything it does. A much more top-down organization like NRDC can come up with internally consistent policy proposals because they have no democratic inputs whatsoever. You either are a member or you're not, and that's the extent of your ability to influence what they do. I think, growing up here, I grew up in Redlands, and I grew up at a time when Riverside was considered second only to Tokyo, Japan, for being the most air-polluted city in the world. I remember riding my bicycle home on a hot, smog-alert afternoon and coming home and coughing constantly for 20 minutes as a result of riding home in that smog, and wouldn't have even been able to say my name. I was, coughing so hard. The air pollution is not as bad. We all know that what comes out of the end of a tailpipe is only 5 to 10% of what came out of the typical tailpipe, say in 1965. Of course, the ultimate consequence, and it was certainly good to reduce the pollution, but it then did allow the tenfold and more multiplying of the actual numbers of cars on the road. So there's still plenty of air pollution here. It's not quite as bad, but in doing something that seems undeniably good, we then allowed the continual explosion of Southern California in terms of population in an area where you can question whether or not given the fact that we're a desert climate, that this is really the place for unlimited population growth. And that, I think, really goes to the question of that you're raising, is in by trying to mitigate the adverse environmental effects, don't we just really improve it enough such that it can even continue to explode, in number and in amount. And Bill McKibben, most famous for his book, The End of Nature, he basically asked, well, we're clearly still an adolescent species. We've failed to mature yet and have not yet agreed to kind of place limits on ourselves and our behavior. And our adolescent exuberance continues to exact a fairly significant price on the entire global environment. I fled someplace that was less crowded, less polluted, but in the 15 years I've been in Idaho, about 50% the population has increased by 500,000 of largely, not just Californians, but a lot of Californians following me there. So I mean, it is a dilemma. I certainly don't have a clear answer of how to extract ourselves from the horns of that one. Jay?
It seems to me that we're under a fundamentally flawed paradigm. And aren't we really more like the macaques, spreading our environmental violence through capitalism and consumerism? Because that's what democracy is doing throughout the world. And we're making the stumptails march to our tune of the capitalism and consumerism, and that seems to be a fundamental problem.
Well, I guess I would, if I look at my top 10 list, I guess I would put that in the meme category. We have the meme that increased profit at any expense is good. It's kind of like the old Christopher Stone movie Wall Street. Greed is good, which is actually contrary to every wisdom tradition that the planet has ever produced, which is that greed is bad. And so I think that, but it's a particularly attractive meme, and it's proving itself very inclined to being spread broadly, and all of the negative environmental consequences that flow from it. And I think I see what you mean, that in the sense that, as the economic interests of the now global economy see war as counterproductive to, quarterly profit statements, that they're disinclined and we're becoming more stump-tail-like. Is that where you were going with that metaphor?
No, I actually think we're becoming less stumptail-like. I think the stumptails are becoming more macaque-like.
Well, no, but the stump-tails are macaques. So that was the difference between the mellow macaque and the rhesus monkeys, which were violent and hierarchical.
That's what I meant.
Okay. You had a question back there.
I'm sorry to be so selfish with my question, but I'm missing class, so
Okay.
I just couldn't stand not being here. I missed what you said number 7 was.
Oh,
And do you have a business card where you can be contacted?
yes.
It was a postmodern one, but I didn't.
Oh, postmodern relativism. That's it. Postmodern relativism.
And your example?
Well, I was basically talking about how people, and the notion that everything is relative, that we don't really know anything, and that therefore it's impossible to actually make value choices to say that, more pollution or less pollution coming out of a tailpipe, that choice can even be made, is illegitimate. And it really kind of goes, Thomas Kuhn and, the nature and structure of scientific revolutions back in the 50s was kind of the beginning of this postmodern relativist thinking. And most of the people that profit by doing environmentally harmful things, they don't suffer from postmodern relativism. They're absolutely convinced of the absolute righteousness of their position. But because environmentalists tend to be, dare I say it, more liberal, the postmodern relativist idea is more attractive to kind of the liberal mindset. It's kind of like, well, I don't want to be too adamant about my position because that's just not cool. And so I know a number, like I say, I think that by and large environmentalists are not terribly infected with this meme, but some of them are. And actually, it leads them to soften their willingness to take strong stands. And as far as the contact information, I just wanted to quickly get my email address up here, and this is probably the easiest way to reach me. Craig.
When you say that the current, a lot of the memes we have and the overall philosophy of postmodernism, I mean, they both really justify or give you a hook to hang your apathy on. We can't create an ideal world, there's all these problems, plus who knows really what's right.
Right.
I mean, just because you can't make an ideal world, just because you can't prove one ideal is the absolute truth, doesn't mean there are things that are wrong. And I think that's one of the problems with a lot of people with postmodernism. They say, well, we can't, nobody has the absolute ultimate truth. Every solution creates a problem, so maybe we should go around condemning something and saying something's wrong. Well, just because one thing doesn't answer everything doesn't mean that something's not wrong.
I agree, and Stanley Fish is a literary critic that is considered to be one of the preeminent postmodernist thinkers. And he just a couple months ago, he actually wrote an article in Harper's, noting that the intelligent design controversy has that those who are proponents of intelligent design have recognized the tools of postmodern relativism as a way to promote their ideas, because essentially they're latching onto evolution, intelligent design. What, you're going to make us say that one is scientific and another isn't? How arrogant of you. And it is interesting to see that people who are really not sympathetic to postmodern ideas at all are nevertheless have gotten very adept at using postmodernist relativism to promote their agenda.
I know that you were talking about being firm in your stance, but isn't there something to be said for some compromise or coexistence? And I'm a member of the Sierra Club, but I also work for a land development agency. We design tract homes, and most of my coworkers are big glamorous people, sand dunes out by between Imperial County, and on one side of the highway is all wilderness, no machines, no four-wheeling, and the other side, if four-wheeling's allowed, it's pretty much what everybody does. And pretty much everybody in the office agrees that you can't, that having it both ways there is the only way to please anybody. Because if you had all wilderness, then no one's ever going to go out and enjoy any semblance of nature. But if it was all four-wheeling, there wouldn't be much of nature left for everybody to go appreciate.
Right. I don't disagree with anything you said there. I know that for me, where I would draw the line is if a particular four-wheeling area was going into some endangered species habitat, I would say, well, then they just can't do it there. They're going to have to do it somewhere else. But we're a democratic society, for better or for worse. There are people that enjoy recreating with four-wheel drive vehicle or off-road vehicles, and in a democratic society, they're going to get accommodated. The question is simply a matter of how do they get accommodated. I think that I'm really, not so much focused here on the, should laws be, stricter or more lax. I'm really kind of focusing on that ultimately the issue comes down to a matter of personal choice. And I'm just really encouraging people to say, to recognize that if the planet is going to get saved, it's not going to happen by accident. There will always be people that will profit from further destruction. It's only going to happen if enough people decide this matters to me, I'm going to inform myself about the issues, and I'm going to actually take as a valuable privilege of citizenship active engagement in the democratic process and insist on better outcomes than we've been getting so far. So I'm really kind of today focusing more on the matter of personal choice and saying that we all need to become environmentally knowledgeable first, but secondly, become environmental missionaries, that we have to be willing to talk one-on-one with other people because that's how paradigms actually change.
As far as the Sierra Club's part in all of this, you mentioned membership roles at the beginning. How much money does the Sierra Club work?
Our annual budget, like for this year, is $77 million. And we have, I mentioned the fact that we have 64 chapters nationwide and 350 groups. Then we have a total staff nationwide of about 500 people. 300 of them are in San Francisco, which is where our headquarters are, about 100 in DC, and about another 100 spread out across America. I believe that, I think the local chapter has a staff person.
How much of that is spent on PR, getting the word out?
Well, it depends on what you mean by PR. We don't use much in the way of television advertising because we've actually learned that television advertising is it doesn't work anymore. People are just so inundated with television ads that form of media just runs into a stone wall. And so where the club has been channeling its resources for really the last about 10 years is really more in putting together door-to-door campaigns of our organizers that go out and knock on doors, and often the same doors, because we've actually learned that it takes about 12 contacts. They don't all have to be in-person contacts, but a combination of in-person and then follow up by letter and by phone calls to move people's opinions and simply their knowledge of the area, because people have become so effective at tuning people out. So that's where we actually channel most of our resources, is that kind of on-the-ground, person-to-person, one-on-one contact. And I guess you could call that a kind of PR, but it's not what most people usually think of. But that is where we put our focus. You know?
Just thinking about, as you're saying, the interest groups within the Sierra Club, you've got the people interested in quality of efficiency, other ones want to save the forest and so forth. Is the Sierra Club, could it be more effective? I'm not quite sure what I want to say this. You've got such a division among the so-called, you've got a lot of different sorts under one umbrella. And each one of these has, super true believers in their own particular perspective. You got to save the trees before you do anything with all the other trees. They have sort of an elitist outlook. They're very narrow and inflexible. And in a society like ours, democratic procedures, almost require some sort of compromise. How much of a problem is that within the environmental movement, that you've got people who are extremists?
Mm-hmm.
You like to talk about Earth First.
Sure.
Put nails in trees and so forth. How much, and that brings a bad press. A couple of years ago, there was a Earth First attack on some General Motors dealership selling Hummers over in, I think, Pomona or Covina, something like that, where they destroyed $100,000 worth of, this wonderful vehicle that everybody was responsible.
Including your governor.
Exactly. And so, but obviously, when it was published, it didn't reflect well on the environmental movement. You've got these people out there, tree huggers,
Sure.
and eco-Nazis, and so forth.
Well, I guess a couple of clarifications. Our mission statement talks about the Sierra Club uses all lawful means. So, the Sierra Club has never approved and would never approve, tree spiking or Hummer burning or anything like that. And actually, Earth First, has moved to kind of strictly civil disobedience. I'm pretty sure, the Hummer incident was really ELF, Earth Liberation Front. The radical fringe of the movement is moved to ELF these days. And, I wish they'd knock that stuff off, because frankly, I think it is incredibly counterproductive for exactly the reasons that you mentioned. But they don't ask me. So, Jeff?
Excuse me, I read an article not too long ago that sort of talking about the environmental movement, the state of it, and today in America. And there was a nice little formulation where it basically said environmentalism equals liberalism equals enemy. And the way that people, a certain segment of the population sneer, this word liberalism, which almost can't be used anymore.
Right.
You sort of get a sense it's the same things happening with environmentalism, that these things have been linked together. There's this sneering, and people that would define themselves as environmentalists 20 years ago, when everybody did, that somehow that's changed somehow, and this word has a completely different sort of connotation and meaning for a lot of people now, and how that plays out in the political world.
That's definitely an issue. And frankly, I personally believe that all environmental groups, the Sierra Club included, for too long, until it was almost too late, kind of relied on a certain complacency of public opinion polls that showed that 80% of Americans would accept the label environmentalist. It may not have been their #1 issue, and they may very well have been voting other issues when they'd actually go to the ballot box. But for quite a long time, a super majority, 80%, would accept the title environmentalist. But over the last 15 years, I guess I would put this in my Orwellian doublespeak category. The right has been pretty effective as being able to portray environmentalists as elitists. Actually, I don't know very many environmentalists that I think that that's a fair label for. I can think of a few, but by and large, I don't think that environmentalism has an elitist element to it. But I think that, Rant Radio, Rush Limbaugh and company have been pretty good at disseminating that bad meme out there, that, care for the earth is, somehow wacky. And, I think at another level, these issues are, when, some ridiculous statement is made by, somebody on the other side, actually doing the education that's necessary to show the fallacy of the accusation, takes some time and effort. Our issues are not as easily reduced to sound bites. And so that really, creates a public education hurdle to get over. And there was some new kind of hopeful polling, however. Americans have consistently said they would like higher fuel efficiency standards. They want their cars to get better mileage. But when asked, do you think higher gas taxes is a good way to kind of discourage public use of cars, there's always been a supermajority say, no way would we want that. But there was actually a poll that the New York Times did just in the last couple of weeks, basically saying that when asked the question, if you knew that your increased gas taxes would be going to actually guarantee the creation of higher fuel efficiency cars, would you support them in that circumstance? Because I think some of the people that have done the analyzing is that the public, quite understandably, has feared you could have higher gas taxes, even as Detroit continues to refuse to make higher mileage cars. So you could have the worst of both worlds, high taxes and still gas guzzlers. And so you wouldn't want that outcome. But that if they saw the gas tax as connected to actually creating the higher fuel efficiency standards, that a majority, I forget exactly, I think it was 59%, it was kind of a surprisingly high majority, said, yeah, in that circumstance, they could imagine supporting higher gas taxes.
But isn't it just selfish altruism?
I'll take it. Mike, and then this gentleman.
Okay, I read the Death of Environmentalism essay, and I actually see two themes that you have in common with their essay.
Okay.
One is that what they're talking about is the issue of environmentalism has become a special interest. And so what they're saying is, the public has to understand that the environment is not a standalone issue.
realities where a lot of dangerous activities in the corporate sector have, over the last 25 years, tended to get concentrated in the communities of the politically weak. Not simply people of color, but certainly including people of color and people of low economic status, that is where, polluting corporations have found that they can, put toxic dumps. The Sierra Club has recognized that and has, actively made ourselves available, never tried to, go in and say, we're here to help, but have always, when there has been an invitation from an oppressed community to say, we really would appreciate your help, we have been eager to provide it. So that's been one area where we've recognized that, social justice and environmental outcomes are intimately connected. Another area where we're, actively, engaged with labor and deepening our relationships with labor is the Blue-Green Coalition and the Apollo Project. And the idea of the Apollo Project is that as we move to a saner energy economy, that there is all manner of high-paying union jobs out there to, facilitate and build, the infrastructure of this new, energy reality that we need. And so I think in that sense, certainly in the Sierra Club, and I think it's broader too, we're really trying to engage with broader spectrums of the public. One of the areas that I'm particularly interested in is the faith community outreach. Is that, in evangelical Christian environmentalism is a new and increasingly influential part of the political spectrum. They certainly would never ever accept the title environmentalist, but they pretty much want all the same things. And so I don't care what they call themselves, and if they and they call it creation care, and I think that's great. So that. On the other hand, the Sierra Club, we call ourselves a big tent. We have, animal rights vegans and hunters and anglers. And frankly, they don't like each other, but they are both within the Sierra Club. And as, coming from Idaho, I think you could, take say we're gonna ban all hunting, and maybe that would fly in California. I can tell you it would not fly in Idaho. And if the Sierra Club were to take that position, we would lose so much credibility we wouldn't be able to accomplish anything else in the state. And yet within the Sierra Club, we do have some of those kind of, let's embrace our identity as a liberal. And some of our members that live in Santa Monica will say, hunters are such an irrelevant constituency anymore. We can afford to write them off and really just go after PETA and have them embrace us. Well, in some parts of the country, I think that's probably true, but there are major chunks of rural America where that wouldn't be true. So that would be where I think I might disagree with Schellenberger and Nordhaus in that there are conservative reasons, politically conservative reasons to do the environmentally right thing. And we still would like to encourage those that would regard themselves as conservatives, but who can see the conservative reasons for doing environmental protection to say, yeah, I won't, the Sierra Club seems to appreciate, that a conservative can want to do the environmentally right thing too. And for those that are really looking to kind of engineer the next liberal takeover of America, that kind of thinking kind of makes them mad, and they don't like it. So that, I think, is part of what Schellenberger's and Nordhaus's essay, kind of the unspoken undertones behind that. Now, you had a question.
Yeah, I was actually glad to hear you talk in the last several responses you've had about the connectedness between different issues. And that's where I've seen a lot of the problems with the environmental movement, is that we tend to get too focused on one issue. So we think about energy efficiency, and we don't see the connection that higher taxes might have in terms of playing a role. Or we see that ethanol is going to be the solution and not worrying about that, well, it takes too much energy to get the ethanol. So we don't see the connections between all of this. And even if we look at other types of energy like oil, it's not just the cost of getting the oil out of the ground and refining it, but we need to think about the full cycle. It's the cost of the waste and pollution.
Right. and then Craig.
I have a question.
Okay.
Partly it falls under your partial success
Mhm.
theory. What is the Sierra Club doing to promote the environmental movement among young people today? Because I'm president of the Green Earth Club here on campus, and I also work with the Alliance to Save Energy. And I notice a really big trend on our campus with the students that it's like, oh, environmentalism, clean air, energy efficiency, that was what my parents did. You're a tree hugger. They kind of did all that before with my parents. I don't want to go through that again.
Okay.
So what is the Sierra Club doing to tackle that kind of attitude?
Well, we have our Sierra Student Coalition. Are you familiar with SSC? And if you were, they have an affiliation process if you're interested in having your own campus group affiliate. It pains me as I have, gotten rather gray myself as I look around at my fellow Sierra Club activists, is that we are an aging bunch. But it does vary quite a bit from chapter to chapter. A number of chapters, I was just up at a training in the Alaska chapter where it seemed like at least a third of the active chapter leaders were in their 20s. So it's something that we're aware of, and it's something that I and at least a few others on the board are actively trying to think of ways to bring more youthful energy into the Sierra Club. We had a joint meeting with the Sierra Club of Canada this last summer, and up in Canada they have what I think is a model that we in Sierra Club US might think of actually adopting, of actual youth positions on various Sierra Club committees that you couldn't fill if you weren't 30 or under. Because I, for one, am very worried about making sure that the next generation sees the Sierra Club as someplace that it would want to concentrate its energy. Now, as you deal with the folks that are saying, well, that just kind of seems old hat. Do they really see that the issues have gone away, or that they just kind of bored with them and don't want to be involved with them?
I think it's a mixture of both. I think when the issues aren't in their face, they don't have to deal with the smog alerts and everything as much anymore, the problems. And two, I kind of think they don't care anymore because they like the prestige of driving their lifted trucks and their big gas guzzling cars. That people look at that and give them recognition for it. So, I don't know.
Yeah, it is. It's hard to, it's ultimately a certain behavior is being rewarded with social status, and how do you start dismantling those memes? I think that's the most powerful, analytic tool that I've kind of latched on to in the last, several years, is this notion of, once a bad meme takes hold, it's not an easy thing to get out. Craig, you were about to say something.
Part of that is the way environmentalists have approached issues. Number one, you look at Kerry's campaign. We must stop the sabotaging of environmental laws by the Bush administration. Well, most of us in this room could probably write 3 pages worth of things that they've sabotaged. The average voter, maybe what? Okay, National Wildlife Federation said, this is last year, of 50 plus environmental decisions that have been litigated and gone to a decision, all of them announced on a Friday. Okay, all but one have been overturned and been found that the Bush administration was doing something illegal, and 80% of those decisions were made by Republican judges appointed by Republican presidents. Making that as an ad would be effective. Okay, an effective ad, we've talked about this before. Take the contract with America. Have somebody ask President Bush, you supported the contract with America. Why do you want to sell off all but 10 national parks? He would deny it and say he wouldn't do it. Contract America states all but 10 national parks should be sold to private entities. Okay? You now have him, the average American would go, you want to sell off our national parks? And then you say, if he's willing to sell off all but 10 of our national parks, which Bush probably didn't agree with the thing. Okay. Think what he's doing in other policies that aren't so clear cut. The leadership, politically, has acted like, everybody knows these things. Well, guess what? Information overload. They don't. You want to give young people something to get upset about, you know. And the second thing on that is, instead of attacking monster trucks, people should say, you need to have low polluting, high gas mileage vehicles. I mean, senior engineering students have taken a Ford Expedition and gotten it so they'll have 35 miles per gallon. Just say, hey, you have to have high mileage. We don't care if you have a big truck. You can have it. You know, then you won't alienate people. But when you go out and say, your motorcycles are bad, you're going to Glamis is bad, people are like, wait a minute, I'm not a bad person. And you lose them on other things.
There's so many environmental groups. There's 10 billion. There's the Sierra Club. There's the National Parks Conservation Association. There's the Wildlife Fund. There's all of them. Ranging from even the Ducks Unlimited, which is designed for hunters. And what does the Sierra Club do with and have interactions with other environmental groups? Because, as we said, the Sierra Club has such a broad range of interests when others can be very narrow.
Yeah, well, the Sierra Club does coalition with, pretty much at all levels with all those other groups. We're not always in agreement. I mean, sometimes we're on different sides of an issue, but, for the most part, for instance, there's something called the Green Group, which is essentially the executive directors of all the Washington, D.C. based environmental groups. So that basically people, environmental groups that have a nationwide membership, that have an office in D.C., and that have a major focus on public policy from a DC perspective. That's called the Green Group. It meets quarterly, so our executive director goes to that and is a fairly influential member within that group. But then, right here, the San Gorgonio chapter of the Sierra Club, to the extent that you're working on a local issue, would work with, when I was getting active with the Sierra Club down here, we were regularly partnered with Audubon, with the Wildlife Society, with the Native Plant Society, on just about all issues. So it would just depend, on the issue that we were dealing with. So yeah, there are a lot of groups, and certainly the Sierra Club tries to partner with all of them and not reinvent the wheel and not be working at cross purposes. Al?
We were in the trenches here close to 30 years ago, and it's very painful to live in this area because we have so little to show for it. And it was only several years ago, because of the support by the Wildlands Conservancy, that the Center for Biodiversity, I mean, they're litigious, but without them, this would not be a livable place. But so many people hate them. They had to move out of their Idlewild logs because they were always threatened to be bombed.
Right.
And now they're in Yucca Valley, and so I don't see anybody even close to coming to this success, but then everybody just sees them as a bunch of lawyers making money and litigating everything. So I wish the Sierra Club would partner with them a little bit more, but maybe they're more effective by doing their own.
They probably are.
Yeah.
And the Sierra Club, because we're as big as we are, we don't qualify for Equal Access to Justice Act attorney fee awards. So like the one time that I did represent the Sierra Club, I had to do it completely pro bono, knowing that I could never expect an attorney fee award even if we won. One of the ways that the club more recently has dealt with that is, for the first time, we have a fairly active law program where we have in-house lawyers that help various Sierra Club entities across the country. And when nobody else but Judicial Watch, a conservative bunch, was willing to sue the Bush administration over the Cheney Energy Task Force, it was our in-house attorneys at the Sierra Club that spearheaded that all the way to the Supreme Court. So we've kind of addressed that issue of, we now have 10 lawyers, but again, that's not very much to try to do everything that needs to be done across America. So you have to be very judicious in how we choose to use those resources. And the Center for Biological Diversity is very good at generating their own funding and don't really need our help. But I agree that they're, some worry that they're so litigious that they're the #1 threat to the Endangered Species Act. And I mean, there's some truth to that. But I've never been much of the idea of, we can't actually use a statute because then it might go away. because that's a de facto repeal. So, you know, use it as long as you've got it, is kind of my philosophy. Jeff?
Well, this big tent idea, and I know that in the Sierra Club there was a huge sort of debate, and even at the electoral board level of population versus immigration. And could you give us your perspective on how that played out and the after effects of that?
Okay. You know, you may have heard over the last 2 board elections, it was a fairly controversial issue. It's not a controversial this year because of the fact that, you know, the national membership by, 20% to 80% defeated the pro-immigration restriction policy that was actually on the ballot last year, and that policy was defeated by a 20% to 80% margin. And so those that were really pushing for that within the club, have gone away for now. I think it's going to be a cycle. My own prediction is that immigration will be back on front burner roughly 10 years from now. It's certainly never going to actually go away permanently, but for now it has. And for essentially my own position, if you're interested in it, is if you went to bernardzaleha.com and clicked on my Sierra Club link, I have a 4-page essay that I wrote back during the heat of that controversy of why the Sierra Club should remain neutral on the immigration issue. And so for the time being, it's died down. Those that were promoted it were, visibly unsuccessful. And so for the time being are not going to be promoting it. But I also know they haven't gone away, but they have kind of receded for a while. It was, they had a specific strategy, and going for high-profile celebrity candidates like ex-Governor Richard Lamb from Colorado was their strategy that they were counting on. But the Sierra Club is a group of organizers. If we know nothing else, we know how to organize. And when that kind of outside threat was perceived, the Sierra Club organized itself internally and dealt them a defeat. And so at this point, we really don't. A couple of the directors that came onto the national board with me that were in that camp, they're going off the board and aren't running for re-election. They weren't nominated to run, and they didn't choose to run by petition. So at this point, we're going to have a very boring national board election this year. I'm the only incumbent running for re-election. So.
Well, many of us are from the urban planning class.
By the way, just let me mention that Bernie avoided my urban planning class. And he never took my Understanding the City course.
That's right.
So you may not know very much about planning, but go ahead and ask.
We talk about sprawl, the inland empire is continuing to grow, and there's a lot of new development. Do you see a link between, what could you say is the link between planning and environmentalism in the future?
I guess I've always thought them intensely connected. And I grew up in Redlands when my folks moved out here when I was 4 years old in 1961. I remember when all of what is now Merino Valley was wheat fields. I remember taking a 50-mile bike ride for my honors patch in biking through wheat fields that are now the city of more than 100,000 people known as Merino Valley. And my folks moved to a little subdivision right smack dab in the middle of the Redlands orange groves. I think of that little subdivision as kind of like the first little cancer cell that, now the orange groves are largely just gone. I remember when they were dairies, 2 blocks away from me, and as I understand it, there really are no dairies in Southern California anymore. They're now all in Southern Idaho, and your milk comes down to you from there. They all moved to Idaho, and and where? In the San Joaquin Valley. And the Southern Idaho dairy farms produce as much mammalian waste as Los Angeles, thereby, but with fewer environmental restrictions. So, these various environmental issues get pushed around you know, as the growth machine, you know, churns along. So intimately connected, you know, there are smart ways to grow. I know, you know, the Sierra Club did have its, you know, Sprawl Hurts Us All campaign for, you know, the last 7 years, and, you know, has identified the, you know, the worst sprawling examples. And actually now we've actually issued some kind of awards to developers who are doing smart growth. Most recently, I think we issued our first one in Utah. And we actually have a number of developers that are clamoring at our door asking how they can get similarly blessed.
So if you went to the Sierra Club homepage, you could get on the sprawl.
Yeah, I suspect it would be sierraclub.org/sprawl, but, you know, just, you know, search the site for our sprawl committee.
You may have answered one of my questions. I have two. One is, if I wanted to find information about alternate energy sources for housing, like I was building a house, solar, like passive solar, and kind of the difference in that, just to educate myself on that. Would there be a link through Sierra Club that would lead me there?
There might be. I'll admit that I'm not you know, energy is not my own particular policy expertise. I'd be surprised if we didn't have something like that, but I can't say for certain.
Well, my second question is, and I had a midterm, so I
Okay.
here, but did you talk about the media and how the media, how corporate PR firms affect the media that's presented in terms of issues like global warming and things like that, and you know, how to look past that and research past that? Did you discuss that?
I didn't really. I touched on it, the thing that I was talking about, memes, and that's, you know, what really media is all about, is instilling certain ideas in people's heads. You know, I think, at least up in Idaho, I've been seeing, you know, TV ads that, you know, say livegreengoyellow.com. You know, it's basically an ethanol promotion. And, you know, it's been a source of controversy within the Sierra Club on ethanol. Basically, we have a couple of scientists even on our board that recognize that ethanol is a dubious proposition, especially corn-based ethanol. You know, on the other hand, it's very popular in certain farm states. And you know, you see that the Sierra Club recognizes, you know, that we're challenged in trying to find ways to compete effectively in the world of media. One of our big initiatives right now is that we are now producing something called Sierra Club Chronicles that is distributed through something called Link TV, which you can only see if you happen to have a satellite dish. But if you have either the Dish Network or DirecTV, one of their channels, you would be able to see 7 different shows on what's called Sierra Club Chronicles, and we've actually gotten some foundation grants to help us produce some good, compelling half-hour stories on environmental issues. And so, you know, since the beginning of time when I was thinking about these issues, you know, recognizing our inability to really compete, you know, with corporate advertising has always hurt us. But we're always exploring ways to try to, you know, get around that. And in some ways, I think that the new media of environment of the, you know, the internet and other alternative ways of delivering information, even of a media sort, in some ways, you know, the ability to produce DVDs, you can produce a DVD that's pretty well produced and do the house party mechanism. You know, the anti-Walmart campaign has been quite effective with that, you know, and, you know, other kinds of guerrilla media, you know, like Outfoxed, you know, that was, you know, getting the word out on the Fox network and that sort of thing. So we're constantly trying to explore that and, you know, try to, you know, a $77 million budget might seem like a lot, but it's a drop in the bucket compared with those that are primarily promoting the other's agenda.
I was going to say, on that right there, sort of addressing the gentleman's thing about advertising. Remember on PBS, one of the spokesmen for the Washington Coalition group of environmental groups was asked about spending for outreach and for information. And he said that, you know, both, you know, the auto industry in one day, the energy industry in one day, you know, spends more than every environmental group in that coalition has for the entire year. You know, but I think also though we need to be smarter in how you reach out. Like you read articles on global warming, and they always quote these top scientists. Well, that's really good if you're an academic or if you're a true student of issues. You want to go to the science. Forget them. The average, oh, we got this other scientist who says this. The head of BP, who's got a doctorate in physics, says global warming is real and it's caused by humans. The head of Shell says global warming is real, caused by humans. Those are the only two people we should quote. You know, say, go argue with the head of the two of the biggest petroleum companies in the world. You know, they say it's real. Maybe these other guys are just being dishonest and devious. You know, instead of, oh, we got a scientist to say, like, hey, somebody who's saying we're doing it and we want to quit doing it is much more credible than somebody who's, quote, well, they're just saying it because it's their academic career and they got grants from somebody.
That was kind of along the lines of my question, because as far as the experts that are quoted, and actually one of the class I just came from, one of the projects that we had was to look up scientists who debunk, say, global climate change, and then to look to see whether they're talking out of the scope of their area, or what of expertise, who they're funded by, what group,
Right.
or the group that they're associated with, what who they're funded by, and I discovered that ExxonMobil funds quite a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Very interesting. I earned my extra points just like
Right.
that. I was actually appalled.
Right.
It's just amazing. There is actually, and I was going to ask you too, if there's links to find out what like corporations like that have, like who they fund and that sort of thing from Sierra Club. I found
Our corporate accountability committee might very much have that sort of thing. But it certainly is a phenomenon, and we've known about it for a long time. I actually first heard the term, here at the San Gregorio Chapter Conservation Committee of the biostitute. You can always buy a scientific opinion.
Bernie,
Jim?
this talk today, do you have it on your website?
I don't, but I'm intending to put it on my website soon. It'll probably be on my personal website. I'm not sure Carl Pope would let me put it on the Sierra Club's website. Ted?
This kind of ties in with several different things you talked about and questions from the audience. Within the last 3 months, Discover Magazine talked to different experts on global warming and tried to get little sound bites from them about what they think is going on and what needs to be done. And you get the standard responses, but one of the top atmospheric scientists said, the inertia or momentum is so great with the climate change and the public commitment is so limited, government and public, nationally, internationally, that we shouldn't be worrying about these trivial little things to slow it. We should be worrying about adaptation.
Right.
What are we going to do as humans to adapt to the inevitable change that we institute?
Was that Lovelock? Isn't that what, didn't Lovelock say that?
That was his little soundbite.
Yeah.
We should be worrying about adaptation.
Yeah, and the other thing that, it's certainly something the Sierra Club is going to have to deal with, because, there are some other economic interests that have latched on to global warming and said, global warming is real, ergo we need a massive amount of new nukes. And that's had a number of erstwhile, quotes, environmentalists are really jumping on that, oh, we've got to get going with nukes again, bandwagon. And so, that's always something to just be aware of. The Sierra Club continues our opposition to nuclear power. We don't think it's necessary. But we think that we may very well need to rely on more natural gas as the transition fuel until we can actually move to a full renewable economy. So, we're trying to, recognize that in the transitional period, some fossil fuels will have to be utilized, and using the ones that are cleanest is what makes the most sense.
So if no nukes, where do we go for sustainable energy then?
Wind. Here's an interesting statistic. I just at an ACLU function, I bumped into the main wind power development guy for Idaho Power. And he gave me this interesting little statistic. He said, Imagine that you had a 100-mile wide strip of wind farms from Texas to the Canadian border, basically going right up through the middle of America. And it was all just absolutely dedicated to wind. That would be enough windmills to produce every possible energy need that America has. Wind is currently the only form of energy that is already cost competitive with any other type of source, coal or whatever, and certainly not nuclear, because it's the most hazardous and most expensive. However, my biggest headache as Vice President of Conservation for the last year has been dealing with the fact that there certainly are some within the Sierra Club that think, well, we don't like the look of windmills. I remember when I was a 10-year-old, the very first windmill out there by Desert Hot Springs, going up as a prototype. I'm not sure I imagined what is there now, and by and large, I think it's a good thing, but I'm certainly not going to tell you it isn't a visual intrusion. And so there certainly are, folks, our whole Maryland chapter says, we're okay with wind 25 miles off coast, but nowhere else in our entire state. Now, commercial wind would want to be on the Appalachian ridgelines. That's where there is the type of wind in Maryland that is commercially viable. And it also happens to be on a migration route of songbirds, et cetera. And so, to air our dirty laundry a little bit here and maybe, inflame the debate a little. I mean, there are some within the Sierra Club say, the Bush administration, through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, is being too protective of birds and interfering with wind development. And there are others within the Sierra Club who are saying, what? We don't usually blame the Bush administration for being too protective of anything. Do we actually want to be in a position where we're taking a less protective position? That's a controversy within the club right now. It has not been resolved. It will eventually get resolved somehow. There are some that are saying, well, this is all part of Bush's conspiracy to have too high a standards for wind to promote coal and nuclear. Now, I can't rule that out. That's something I could, think this guy could be guilty of. But, as far as, John Muir is most famous for the quote, when you pick out something and try to take it apart, find it connected to everything else in the universe, wind is a classic example of it. Nevertheless, wind is, our best, thing that the technology is there, and there are places that it can be sited where it's good, that you can have large amounts of industrial wind that can generate a lot of power in a way that is not going to be as environmentally harmful. There's no such thing as no harm, but less harm than the other alternatives.
In the next 10 or 20 years, kind of twofold question, where do you think the Sierra Club is going to focus more resources?
Over what time period?
Over 10 or 20 years, so in the near middle future. And then you personally, if you disagree with that, where would you focus more?
Well, that's actually something I don't have to be too hypothetical about. The Sierra Club over the last year and a half went through a fairly significant, broad, nationwide, deliberative process of where do we think the club should go and focus its energies. And then surveys went out to all chapters and groups, and then we had our first ever of its kind convention in San Francisco back in early September. And then as a result of all that process, our board of directors back in November adopted 3, we're calling them the Smart Energy Solutions Conservation Initiative, our America's Wild Legacy Conservation Initiative, and Safe and Healthy Communities Conservation Initiative that we've adopted as the areas of emphasis for the next 5 to 10 years. So that is the area, and then superimposed on top of that, we have said that for the next decade, moving America to a new smarter, better energy economy is our #1 priority. And I agree with that. So I agree with our initiatives, and I agree with the overriding initiative that energy really is what requires our greatest amount of attention because of global warming, et cetera.
Now, the
sprawl, water pollution, drinking water.
And that would be on the Sierra
Yes.
website and so forth.
That's right. And one of the things that is kind of the our new mantra is, state things in a positive frame, and I think, there's plenty of social science research to say that's the way to present your message. So we don't talk about, let's go out and fight against air pollution and against water pollution. What we're for is safe and healthy communities. And, by the way, how can you have that with air pollution and with water pollution and with toxics in your drinking water, et cetera? But we lead with the message that, what we're trying to do here is create safe and healthy communities for people to live in. And, instead of, stopping logging, we're trying to protect America's wild legacy. And rather than saying fight global warming, it's don't we want smart energy solutions? And then I mentioned NEPA early in my talk. I've been, continually trying to remind some of the non-lawyers on our board that if you want dumb energy solutions, repeal NEPA. That'll be the best way to have some really dumb energy solutions come down the pike, is to refuse to do any environmental analysis on the solutions that you're actually proposing.
I'm not quite understanding then what the difference between what you're saying now and what the authors of the Death of Environmentalism is.
Well, I do think that the Death of Environmentalism folks are, you kind of have to read between their lines. Most people that read the essay say it's kind of hard to figure out exactly what points they're making. You can see some areas of emphasis. And they don't seem to like, the Sierra Club's big tent approach. There are certain people that they would just like to see kicked out of the environmental movement because they don't focus on, quotes, human-centered issues enough. I think that those are some of the areas where I would disagree with, Schellenberger and Nordhaus, and that we as the Sierra Club, who do try to be a broad tent that allows anybody involved in environmental issues that wants to have an avenue to channel their energy. And you don't have to be an Ivy League scientist from Yale to go work for the NRDC, but you can just be an American citizen in San Bernardino interested in planning to say, I want to work on that issue through my local chapter. And that's really what the Sierra Club does best, is to providing those avenues for any American citizen interested in these issues to get actively involved in them.
Okay. Well, thanks, Bernie. I know you're going to stick around for a while.